All right, diving deep with you today into environmental ethics. We're tackling excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on environmental ethics.
Oh, it's dense.
It is quite dense, but we'll break it down, make it a little more digestible.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a rich area, especially for, a philosopher. It really gets you thinking about those assumptions we have about value and morality. Like, do they still work when we're talking about our duties to the natural world? Or do we need, like, a whole new set of ethics?
That's the question, isn't it? And right away, we run into this concept of anthropocentrism, that
Hmm.
deeply ingrained human-centered view.
Yeah, like humans are at the top.
Yeah, top of the pyramid, the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And that's where things get sticky.
Yeah, because if our ethics revolve around human well-being, how can we argue for the moral worth of, say, a rainforest ecosystem? Like,
Right.
does a mountain have intrinsic rights? It really stretches our philosophical thinking.
Big time. And speaking of stretching, let's unpack this idea of intrinsic versus instrumental value. That feels like the heart of so much of environmental ethics.
Yeah, definitely.
So if I'm understanding this right, something has instrumental value if it's useful to us humans, like a means to an end.
Right, a tool.
Right, but intrinsic value means it's valuable just because it exists, regardless of whether it's useful to us or not.
You got it. And that distinction really underpins a lot of the debate in environmental ethics. Like, do we value a forest only for the timber it provides, its instrumental value? Or do we recognize it as a complex ecosystem, deserving of respect just because it exists, that intrinsic value? And this has real implications, for how we think about policy. Like, take endangered species. Should we only protect those with a clear instrumental value to humans, or should all species have a right to exist, regardless of their utility to us?
That's such a powerful question. Makes you think about how deeply ingrained anthropocentrism really is. Okay, let's step back in time for a moment. We're in the 1960s and 70s, a time of big changes, and the environmental movement is really starting to gain momentum.
Right, lots of upheaval.
Yeah. And the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions thinkers like Lynn White, Richard Routley, and Aldo Leopold coming onto the scene. What was the intellectual climate like back then? What was in the air?
Well, think Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, exposing the dangers of pesticides, and those first images of Earth from space, fragile, alone. The whole idea of human dominance was being questioned.
Right, on many levels.
Yeah. And Lynn White, for example, argued that this Judeo-Christian idea of dominion over nature, that was actually at the root of our ecological crisis, a pretty radical thought for the time.
Yeah, really shaking things up. So these early environmental ethicists, they were pushing for a fundamental change in how we see nature, moving away from this master mentality.
Oh, absolutely. And Richard Routley, he had these thought experiments, last man scenarios, that really forced people to confront the potential problems of a purely anthropocentric worldview. Like, imagine, he said, the last surviving human intentionally destroys every other living thing. Would that be wrong? Most people would say, yeah, of course. But why? Maybe because even without humans around, life itself has intrinsic value.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? It really gets to the core of it. And then there's Aldo Leopold, who developed this land ethic, really taking this idea of intrinsic value further.
Yeah, he was a visionary.
You're a big fan of his, right?
Oh, huge fan. Leopold wasn't just arguing for protecting individual animals or trees. He was advocating for an ethical obligation to the whole biotic community, to the land itself. He saw humans not as separate from, but as a part of this community, with more responsibilities to preserve its integrity, stability, and beauty, to use his words.
So this goes beyond just caring for individual creatures. We're talking about valuing those ecological wholes.
Yeah, the interconnectedness of it all.
It's a big leap for ethics, really. It raises so many questions, like how do you even define the good of an entire ecosystem?
That's where it gets tricky for sure, philosophically and practically. But it's such an important concept because it forces us to think about how everything is connected. What affects one part of the ecosystem affects the whole.
Yeah, it's all intertwined. And that brings us to another big name, Arne Nies, and the concept of deep ecology.
Oh, deep ecology. That's where things get really interesting.
It does get a bit mind-bending, if I'm understanding it right. It's about expanding our sense of self to actually include nature. It almost has a spiritual or mystical element to it, doesn't it?
You're picking up on something really important there. Nace drew inspiration from his experiences in nature, especially in the Himalayas. And he argued that we need to break down this idea that we're separate, this self versus other, humanity versus nature. He said we're not separate, we're interconnected, all part of the same web of life.
It makes you look at indigenous cultures who see themselves as inseparable from nature in a whole new light.
Right, like maybe they're onto something.
Maybe they hold some wisdom we've lost. Could their perspective be key to solving some of these environmental problems we're facing?
It's a perspective worth exploring for sure. Maybe we can learn from cultures that haven't lost that connection, that haven't drawn such a hard line between humans and the rest of nature.
It's a whole different way of seeing the world. Pretty radical. But to actually put those ideas into practice, to move beyond this focus on individualism, we need to value those ecological wholes, right?
Hmm.
The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions thinkers like Holmes Rolston III, who argue for the inherent worth of entire species and ecosystems.
Yeah, Ralston's work is fascinating. He argues that these bigger ecological entities, they have a value that goes beyond the sum of their parts. It's not just about protecting each individual tree, it's about protecting the forest as a whole, a living system.
Right, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So that raises some tough questions. Is it wrong, for example, to wipe out an entire species of insect just because it's not useful to humans? If we accept that ecosystems have intrinsic value, we might need to rethink a lot of what we do.
Absolutely. And that's where environmental ethics gets really thought-provoking because it forces us to confront these hard questions, these dilemmas, and really reconsider our place in the world.
It's a huge challenge, philosophically and practically. And then there's this idea of sustainability looming over everything. It's everywhere you look these days, but what does it actually mean from an ethical point of view? How do we balance the needs of a growing human population with the need to protect the planet?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The Brundtland Report defines sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
Right, that's the classic definition.
But what does that look like in reality? How do we balance those competing demands, especially with the threat of climate change hanging over us?
It's a huge ethical dilemma. Are we morally obligated to preserve a healthy planet for generations that haven't even been born yet? And if so, what sacrifices do we need to make today?
These are the questions that environmental ethicists are wrestling with right now. And there are no easy answers. But one thing's for sure, the choices we make today will shape the future for humans and for the whole web of life.
It's a big responsibility, a weight on our shoulders. It's not just about us, it's about generations to come. We're all connected across time and across species.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Environmental ethics asks us to think beyond ourselves, beyond our own little bubble, and consider the well-being of the planet as a whole, now and in the future. Back again with our deep dive into environmental ethics.
You know, it's interesting how environmental ethics tries to move away from that human-centeredness, but then keeps coming back to those traditional ethical frameworks to try and make its arguments.
Right.
It's like it's trying to find a way to bridge human morality with a more Earth-centered view.
Yeah, it's like trying to, I don't know, renovate an old house for a new purpose. You've got these existing structures, these foundations like consequentialism and deontology that have been around for ages, centuries.
Right, the cornerstones of moral philosophy.
Exactly. So the question is, can we adapt them to deal with environmental issues? Or do we need something completely new, like new blueprints?
Yeah, maybe we need to tear the whole thing down and start over.
Maybe. It makes you wonder if our current systems can even handle something as complex as the natural world, with all its interconnections.
That's a good question. Like, take consequentialism, the classic example being utilitarianism, the whole greatest happiness for the greatest number thing.
Right, maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering.
And on the surface, it seems like it could apply to environmental issues.
Hmm.
Protecting the environment leads to a healthier planet, which benefits everyone.
In theory, yeah.
But then, I'm already seeing where it gets messy. How do you measure the happiness of a non-human entity? Like, does a tree have the same moral weight as a person? And what about future generations? How do you factor in their well-being when you're making decisions today?
Those are exactly the challenges environmental ethicists are facing. Like, how do you quantify the value of biodiversity or the suffering of an ecosystem? Traditional utilitarianism might not have the tools for that.
It seems like trying to use one scale for everything, especially when you're dealing with such a wide range of values, could really skew things.
Yeah, you could end up prioritizing short-term gains over long-term health.
Exactly. Sacrificing the future for the present.
And that highlights the limitations of a purely consequentialist view. But let's flip the coin and look at deontology, which is more about duties and rules.
Right, so instead of focusing on outcomes, deontology says, do the right thing no matter what.
Yeah, follow the rules based on these universal principles.
Okay, got it. So how does that play out in environmental ethics?
Well, think about animal rights, as championed by philosophers like Tom Reagan.
Okay, yeah, animal rights.
Reagan argues that some animals, those with a capacity for conscious experience, have inherent moral rights, just like humans do.
So it wouldn't matter if exploiting those animals somehow benefited humanity as a whole. It would still be wrong because it's violating their rights.
Exactly. And that thinking has been really influential in arguments against things like factory farming and animal testing. But as you would imagine, it raises some tricky questions too.
Oh, I bet. Like, where do you draw the line? Do all living things have rights? What about plants?
Right. What about plants?
And if we say certain animals have rights, does that mean we can never interfere with them, even if it's for their own good or the good of the ecosystem?
Those are the kinds of debates happening in environmental ethics right now. It's a constantly evolving field, always trying to keep up with these complexities.
So we're basically trying to figure out how to apply these old human-centric ethical frameworks to this whole web of life, this interconnected system.
That's the crux of it.
It's a huge undertaking, but an important one for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. And some philosophers argue that maybe we need to go beyond just adapting these old
Right,
frameworks.
maybe we need to think bigger.
Yeah, like maybe we need entirely new ethical paradigms grounded in an ecological worldview.
Wow, so not just tweaking utilitarianism or deontology, but starting from scratch, building a whole new system based on the principles of ecology.
That's the idea. Thinkers like Aldo Leopold, with his land ethic, they were kind of pointing us in that direction. Like, instead of starting with human rights and then trying to include nature, maybe we need to flip the script.
Start with the interconnectedness and work from there.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big shift.
It really is. It makes you realize how much our ethical thinking has been shaped by that human-centered perspective.
It really does. And this is where the idea of naturalness comes in.
Oh yeah, naturalness.
It's a tricky concept, for sure, loaded with, philosophical baggage.
Huh.
But for some environmental ethicists, it's a core value.
Okay, so they're saying that things have more moral worth if they're natural, untouched by humans.
That's the argument.
So a pristine wilderness would be more valuable than, say, a managed park, even if the park had more biodiversity, just because it's more natural.
That's what some argue, yeah. But obviously it's controversial. Critics say it ignores the role humans have played in shaping ecosystems, for centuries.
Right, like we've been a part of this whole thing for a long time.
Yeah, not just these recent intruders.
And it could also lead to a kind of hands-off approach to conservation that ignores the needs of people, right?
Yeah, that's the other critique. It can be a bit too idealistic.
It's that classic dilemma, preserving wilderness versus using it.
Yeah, finding that balance is key.
It's a tough one. It shows how we need ethical frameworks that take into account both human and non-human values.
Exactly. It's not an either situation.
It makes you wonder, though, is there even such a thing as pristine nature anymore? With climate change, with humans all over the planet, hasn't everything been touched in some way?
That's a question a lot of people are asking. It really challenges our whole idea of wilderness.
Like, maybe it's not about finding untouched places, but recognizing the wildness that still exists, even in places we've changed.
That's the shift in thinking, yeah. Acknowledging the resilience of nature.
So even a city park or a backyard garden can have a kind of wildness if we know how to see it.
Exactly. It's about perspective.
It's kind of hopeful, isn't it? Like, even though we've messed things up, nature's still fighting back.
It is, and it reminds us that our ethical obligations aren't just about protecting those pristine landscapes, but about fostering a healthier relationship with nature in all its forms.
Right, wherever we find it.
Yeah. And that brings us to virtue ethics. How does that fit into all of this?
Okay, so virtue ethics, that's about character, right?
Right.
Not rules or outcomes, but the kind of person you are.
That's the gist of it.
So a virtuous person would naturally do things that benefit the environment, not because they have to, but because it's part of who they are.
Exactly. It's about who you are, not just what you do.
Okay, I see. So what kind of virtues are we talking about?
Well, think about things like humility, compassion, gratitude, respect for all life. Those are qualities that would naturally lead someone to care for the environment.
Right, so instead of always calculating consequences or following rules, you develop this inner compass, this moral sense that guides you.
It's a way of being, not just a set of principles.
So virtue ethics is about cultivating a deeper environmental consciousness, a way of seeing the world that leads to more sustainable choices.
That's a great way to put it. It's about a shift in
It
consciousness.
really is. And that shift is crucial, I think, if we're
Mhm.
going to tackle these environmental challenges.
Agreed. It's not just about doing the right thing. It's about becoming the kind of people who naturally do the right thing.
It's about belonging, feeling connected to something bigger.
Exactly. And that sense of belonging, of being part of this web of life, I think that's at the heart of ethical living in the Anthropocene.
That's powerful. And speaking of the Anthropocene, this era of human impact, let's talk about wilderness. It's such an iconic but also contested space in environmental ethics.
Ah, wilderness, yeah. It evokes both awe and controversy.
Definitely.
For a lot of environmental philosophers, especially those into deep ecology, wilderness has a special meaning. It represents this untouched purity, a reminder of what the world was like before humans took over.
It's like those vast forests or mountain ranges where nature is still in charge.
Yeah, untamed.
We see it as having this spiritual value, a place to reconnect with something bigger than ourselves.
That's the romantic view, and it's compelling. But it's also been criticized for being a bit naive, maybe even harmful.
Harmful? How so?
Well, first off, this idea of pristine wilderness often overlooks the fact that indigenous cultures have lived in and managed these landscapes for centuries. They weren't untouched, they were cared for.
Right, so it erases their history.
Exactly. And another criticism is that focusing on wilderness preservation can sometimes come at the expense of human needs. If you set aside huge areas for conservation, does that displace people who depend on those resources?
It's that tension between conservation and development again.
Always that tension.
How do you find that balance?
It's not easy. It takes careful thought about the social, economic, and ecological impacts of different approaches.
It sounds like a purely hands-off approach might not always be the most ethical choice, especially if it ignores the needs of people.
Right. And it highlights the need for a more nuanced approach to environmental ethics, one that can handle the complexities of human-nature relationships.
So maybe it's not about drawing these hard lines between wilderness and human areas, but figuring out how to coexist more sustainably. Managing our impact in a way that respects both humans and ecosystems.
That's the challenge, and we can't ignore it.
Because ultimately we're all connected, right?
We are. The fate of wilderness is tied to our fate. We're in this together.
And speaking of interconnectedness, what about the built environment? Those human-made spaces don't always get much attention in environmental ethics.
You're right, we tend to focus on those wild places, but most of us live in cities and towns.
Yeah, the concrete jungle.
And how we design and live in those spaces has ethical implications too.
Like, how do we create cities that are both sustainable and livable? Places that are good for people and the planet.
That's the big question. It involves thinking about things like transportation, energy, green spaces, access to nature, social equity, all these interconnected factors.
It sounds like there's a lot of overlap between environmental ethics and urban planning.
Absolutely. Some environmental ethicists say we need to broaden our thinking beyond just natural landscapes and include the built environment as well.
So instead of seeing cities as separate from nature, we should see them as part of the ecosystem with their own ethical responsibilities.
Exactly. And that means thinking about how our cities impact human health, social justice, and biodiversity.
It's like we're all designers shaping the world around us.
We are. And those choices have consequences.
They do. We need to make more conscious, responsible choices.
Choices that lead to a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
And speaking of justice, one of the most challenging aspects of environmental ethics is that intersection of poverty, environmental damage, and inequality.
You're right, that's a crucial point. The poorest communities are often hit hardest by environmental problems, even though they've contributed the least.
It's a terrible injustice.
It is. And a lot of environmental ethicists say we can't address environmental problems without addressing these systemic injustices.
So it's not just about protecting nature, it's about social justice too.
It's both, and they're intertwined. You can't have one without the other.
Like two pillars holding up a roof.
Exactly. And it reminds us that environmental ethics isn't just some abstract idea. It's about real-world issues that need collective action and a commitment to justice.
So we have to think globally and act locally.
Right. See the big picture, but take responsibility for our own actions.
I like that. Think globally, act locally.
It's a good motto. And I think that's what makes environmental ethics so important. It makes us think differently, see the world in new ways, and act to create a better future.
Back for the final leg of our deep dive into environmental ethics.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. From those foundational ideas to some really tough questions. But now I think we need to face the elephant in the room, so to speak, sustainability and climate change.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road, where philosophy has to deal with real-world problems.
Exactly. Policy decisions, individual actions, all with global consequences. The stakes are high.
So let's start with sustainability. It's everywhere you look these days, but what's the ethical core of it?
Well, I think at its heart, sustainability is about intergenerational justice. It's about recognizing that we owe it to future generations to leave them a planet that's, at least as livable as the one we inherited.
It's like we're borrowing the earth from our kids. That's a great way to put it. It forces us to think beyond our own needs, consider the long-term impacts of what we're doing. But then how do we even measure those impacts? What are we obligated to give up now to ensure a good future for them?
Those are the big questions, right? I mean, some people say we shouldn't worry too much about the future. Like, we can't predict what future generations will need or even value. Maybe they'll invent new technologies or adapt to a changed climate in ways we can't even imagine.
It's a thought, and it does bring up some philosophical puzzles. But to just assume they'll be able to fix our mistakes, it's a risky move. And even
Mm.
if they could, do we have the right to make them do it? Don't they deserve a chance to thrive, not just clean up after us?
Like, we had our party, and now they're stuck with the mess. Doesn't seem very fair.
Not really. And it misses the point that climate change isn't just about material stuff. It's about preserving the beauty of nature, the diversity, those things that future generations should get to experience too.
Right, things you can't put a price tag on. Like the feeling of being in an old-growth forest or seeing a coral reef full of life.
Exactly. Those things have value in themselves, and we have a duty to protect them, not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us.
So, given how urgent the climate crisis is, what does ethical action look like? What are we supposed to do individually and collectively?
Tough question. No easy answers. But at the very least, it means acknowledging that climate change is real and it's serious. We need to reduce our own impact, push for policies that promote sustainability, and hold our leaders accountable.
And I think it also means being willing to have those tough conversations with our families, friends, coworkers, even if it's awkward. We need to break through the silence and really build a sense of urgency.
You're right, it's not just an environmental issue, it's a moral one. It's about justice, equity, and responsibility to future generations.
I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed. Like, what can one person do? It's easier to feel powerless against such a big problem.
I get that. But it's important to remember that individual actions, multiplied by millions, can make a real difference. Every choice, every action is a vote for the future we want.
So it's not about being perfect, it's about collective action, working together.
Exactly. And environmental ethics gives us a way to think about these issues, to understand our values and act in ways that create a more just and sustainable future.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into environmental ethics.
Mm.
We've covered a lot, from those big theoretical ideas to the very real threat of climate change.
We've explored the moral dimensions of our relationship with the environment, and I hope this has given you some food for thought. As you continue to think about these issues, ask yourself, if we're truly part of nature, not separate from it, how should we live? What kind of future do we want to create? Not just for ourselves, but for all beings now and in the future.